debater and you're not afraid of a fight. So why have your comments off? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I've turned them on for a lot of things.
On your shorts you do.
Right. In some of my lives, I think they're on. But almost as soon as I turn them on, there's photos of my family's homes.
Okay.
What's the address?
Yeah.
And at what point, and I just want to clarify.
Yeah, please.
I don't have to take that abuse.
Agreed.
Like, I don't come to work and slap the dick out of their mouth. Like,
kind of why do you have a disdain for informants, in your opinion?
I don't disdain them. I downright fucking hate them. Okay. That's okay. But see, this is why I can say it. That guy's crazy. He's on medication. I have a disdain for them because no man should ever go to prison on the words of another man, number one. Number two, in 90% of the cases you look at, the informant has done more vile and disturbing crap than those that are being accused. Number three, I find it oxymoronic when a man, Joey Merlino, because everybody knows who he is, goes in front of a judge, they can bring up everything he's ever been accused of, including murders and whatever else. Even though he's acquitted, it doesn't really matter because it's a character judgment. But yet in that same case, you can't turn that around and say, well, let's judge the rat. Judges don't allow that. So for me, it's like you're walking in, you're already behind.
I'm going to tell you something. If you don't ever bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them attention. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there. Well, he's divorced, you have to do it tough. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is. The most means that the boss is your boss.
Welcome, excuse me, back to Mob Talk Radio. We're going to get into Paul Castellano Part 2. And by the way, for next week, we're going to go back to the poll questions and some other stuff like that. So next week, we'll go back to our traditional 3 or 4 segment show. And once again, thanks for all of the patience and, being patient with me dealing with all this shit and this nonsense. And so we're going to jump right into it. We're going to go right back and sort of pick up where we left off last week. As we mentioned last week, Paul was a complete business juggernaut in every way imaginable prior to becoming a captain within the Gambino crime family. He also had 16 informants plus providing information about him and his entire family. And what is interesting about some of the reports that we do have is just how much the FBI knew, but yet so little they actually did know at the time. The FBI was consistently checking phone records. And what they came across was they noticed something that somebody from Paul's home phone number and Paul's businesses was consistently calling Rockland Mental Hospital. It's also worth noting that the Castellano family went through some sort of schism in the 1950s, and the family was torn apart by something, and nobody seems to know why it happened or what it was about. The informants would explain that while the Castellanos were a huge family, there was something that happened and the family split and stopped talking. Certain parts of the family stopped talking to the other ones. It also could be that the criminal wing and the Castellanos just insulated themselves to avoid the trappings of familial money grabbing. But it's very odd. The FBI would look into the calls going back to Rockland Mental Hospital, and when the FBI checked their records, it showed that Paul Castellano, at least a number from his offices and his home, was calling Rockland Mental Hospital and talking to a patient by the name of Teresa Castellano. At the time, she was a 70-something years old and in the care of Rockland Mental Hospital, and she had been in the Rockland Mental Hospital since the 1930s. So by the time this was found out, she had been there 30 fucking years. The FBI tried to connect those dots but could never substantiate the relationship between Paul Castellano and Teresa Castellano. However, the amount of calls made to that specific patient from Paul's home says there was something else going on. And it sort of reminds me of the Sopranos episode where Uncle Junior is telling Tony they had a kid brother named Eckley who was half retarded or whatever the case may be. They didn't know what it was back then. But this may have been a very similar situation, but it's I don't think anybody's ever said this. I don't think anybody's ever publicly found this out. So it's odd. And we just don't know who she was, how they were related, or what her issues were. But it's interesting to say the least that I came across this. I don't think anybody's ever stumbled sort of upon that. Like I said, they did. The FBI went further on to start searching for all connections leading to Paul Castellano. One of the things they come across was something called Emory Transportation Services, and that's another number that was regularly, repeatedly called by Paul Castellano, leading the feds to believe that he had a controlling interest in the transportation company based out of Newark, New Jersey. And while the FBI could never substantiate it fully, they believed that Castellano, in fact, owned that business as well. The FBI would go on to assert that Castellano had some 36 more legitimate businesses with others as front owners or paper fronts, from automotive places to gas stations. And it just shows you the pure volume of Paul Castellano moving money around like clockwork. Informants would also concede that while these businesses were owned by so-and-so, they knew in the background that Paul Castellano was actually the owner. So on March 26th of 1958, the FBI gets a visit from what the FBI details as TK-1, aka informant number 1. This informant was specifically brought in to discuss the interrelations between and around Armand Tommy Rava, Carlo Gambino, and Paul Castellano and Mike Miranda. And it was only known that these men had relationships as a result of the infamous 1957 Appalachin meeting. The informant would advise the FBI that there was a connection between Rava and Miranda. The informant explained that Rava and Miranda were involved in organized crime and feared in Brooklyn. He also would explain that Paul Castellano was known all over Brooklyn, especially since his brother-in-law, Carlo Gambino, was the alleged boss of the Gambino crime family. Then, let's see here. Okay, so it's also according to the informant that Paul met several out-of-state gangsters through the connection of Carlo Gambino. T1, the informant, would explain that Carlo was the biggest influence in New York City area for organized crime. The informant would go on to explain that they all went to Appalachin together, but the informant believed that Rava and Miranda were not close to Paul Castellano at all, but rather were tighter with Carlo Gambino. The informant stated that Paul had no real major influence in Brooklyn without Carlo, and that he believed Paul was asked to go to Appalachin more as a favor to Gambino rather than having any involvement in organized crime policies, which we know to be not exactly the truth. On March 12th of 58, informant T12, informant number 12, advises the FBI that he cannot ascertain the relationship between Rava, Miranda, and Castellano, but Castellano, Rava, and Gambino are, in fact, in the same criminal circles together, as all men, Castellano, Rava, Miranda, and Gambino, are all members of an Italian criminal organized crime group based in Brooklyn, New York. He stated he hadn't seen Castellano with Rava ever. He did state, but they did know each other from organized crime circles. He went on to say that Castellano was often seen with his brother-in-law, Carlo, however. The FBI would then begin to surveil Castellano, and they found that he was consistently found to be hanging out, and this is what's very interesting. They found out that one of the places he consistently did go was a club on 79th and Utrecht Avenue, which was a social club in Brooklyn. And that club was a members-only mafia club run by Joe Colombo. The informant would supply information that Colombo was meeting with Castellano and his cousins, the Gambinos, on the regular at the club. In mid-1958, the FBI began to get information that Castellano was deeply rooted in the construction business and owned, albeit behind the scenes, a company by the name of Ben Moore Construction. Another informant, T9, would come forward and explain that Paul also owned Kings Highway Woodworking Corporation based in Brooklyn, New York, and upon a credit check, Paul's name did not show up as the owner, but that company had been established since 1926. According to more credit checks in 1958, it shows that Castellano was claiming $850,000 a year in net sales, yet claimed after income taxed payroll that he only made $12,800. And, if you look at that on its heels in a year, that's like $7.3 million a year. I mean, that's fucking insane to me. And what kind of fucking business model is that? If you make almost $1 million a goddamn year in 1958 and you're only claiming $12,000 of that, however, in 1946, this is a little different subset, but in 46, Benjamin Castellano is caught by the War Fraud Unit in New York City, and the Castellanos had a deal in place to supply the U.S. Army with beef, and certain rations legally had to be set aside for other groups, and Benjamin wasn't doing that. The fraud unit came in and went after him. However, it was ascertained by the FBI that Castellano didn't have the necessary facilities to save the meat before the choice became to sell it or just let it go to rot. And it's really a crafty workaround for sure, because the Castellanos had to give away a certain percentage per month for free and at reduced prices, and so they weren't about to do that. So this was their workaround. The courts and the fraud department eventually let those charges go. So at every turn, Castellano's outthinking everybody. So what is known as two things, right? Paul was a captain within the Gambino crime family by 1958. And we know that because multiple informants came forward to explain that Paul was one of 3 Sicilian operations going on in Brooklyn at the time. And one of those informants claimed wrongly that Paul worked for Joe Profaci. And we know that to be absolutely wrong. The other 2 informants claimed that Paul was not working for Joe Profaci, but was in business with him. That makes more sense. The investigation into Paul seems to the investigation into Paul seemed to be the case just after the Appalachin event, as 27 members of the Mafia were arrested on obstruction charges and sent to jail because of that meeting. Joe Magliocco and Castellano were there, for some odd reason, they were named co-conspirators in that indictment, and both refused to answer any questions, and Castellano would languish in jail for almost a year. A year after Appalachin, Paul Castellano and Joe Riccobono would be released from jail. However, others like Carmine Lombardozzi were still locked up for the same exact charges. And while Castellano would eventually be freed on bail, he still faced conspiracy charges for the whole entire Appalachin event. And while Castellano would maintain his innocence throughout the whole entire thing, the court could care less, and they convicted him anyway on December 18th of 1959. Judge Irving Kaufman gave Castellano 5 years in prison for that. And that would be overturned in 1960 for a lack of evidence. So for the next 4 years, the FBI would keep watching Paul Castellano. And it's interesting. It's interesting to see because the FBI wanted to close the investigation. The FBI said, you know what, we're tailing this guy. We're following this guy. We're doing credit checks on this motherfucker. And we just can't get enough on the guy. And they wanted to close the case. However, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York kept arguing with the FBI that Castellano was a criminal, as was Carlo Gambino, and he reported and handed in file after file on Gambino and Castellano, and the FBI kept saying, listen, you keep bringing me all this shit, and we have our reports. There's nothing to investigate. And they suggested that the operation be shut down, and they told the United States Attorney, let it go. There is nothing. However, the United States Attorney absolutely fucking refused, making claims and assertions with very limited proof other than just circumstantial evidence. So the FBI again and again and again said in documents that I have that Paul was not seen cavorting with gangsters. He went to work, he came home, and that any information stated the contrary seemed to them to be bullshit. They once again tried to close Paul's file and just transported anything that sort of came into Carlo Gambino's file. And that same United States Attorney would not stop. And the FBI eventually has to reopen Paul's file in 1962 because the AUSA just would not stop. That's just the way the FBI does. So what eventually happens is 14 more informants come forward, 14 more. And the FBI even the FBI went to Paul's competition to ask questions about his business practices, and nobody would budge. Even his competitors wouldn't say anything about him. And it wasn't until late 1962 that an informant tells the FBI that Paul is a capo regime and that Carlo Gambino is the boss. This informant also gave the FBI information about 2 new businesses that Paul owned. And these are important businesses. Paul owned Fat Rendering Company and P&H Rendering Company, which were both located in Brooklyn, New York. According to the informant, Paul was upped as a result of his uncle Frank Castellano retiring from the Mafia. And it's according to this informant that Frank was a captain, and upon his retirement, the crew was handed to Paul Castellano. So here we go. Nobody's ever said this historically. This is factual. Okay, this is 100% the truth. This is what we know the case to be. But nobody's ever said this before. Nobody's ever come out and said, when did Paul become a captain? Who did he take over from? He took over from his own uncle. And this was legitimately in 1962. It's also in 1962 that 2 more informants come out of the woodwork and explain to the FBI that Paul Castellano controls a restaurant a restaurant union, and that Paul receives $5,000 to $6,000 per union operated store. He also explains to the FBI that Paul is now operating meat businesses in New Jersey, specifically the chain Meat-O-Rama. Sounds like a porn place, in Hackensack, New Jersey, and that Joe Gambino, Carlo's brother, is managing that store. Not long after the opening of that business, Paul opens up another Meat-O-Rama on 14th Street here in Manhattan. The informant then provided information that Paul was now using Lafayette National Bank in Brooklyn because they had an inside guy who would loan money to gangsters without making credit reports and statements that could go back to the FBI. And they were backroom handshake deals without any paper trail, and with some had a high interest rate and others didn't. And here's where it gets really interesting for all you mob traditionalists. On June 20th at 52, informant number 5 tells the FBI that P&H Rendering Company, which Paul Castellano owns, was actually 2/3 of the operations of Fat Rendering Company. P&H dealt, this is huge, P&H dealt directly with butcher shops, whereas Fat Rendering dealt with individuals who serviced the shops. So he's covering 2 unions that control everything, from the butcher shops themselves and those who service the machines and bring the items. In other words, this is a union shakedown, okay? He goes on to explain that the Interdestine Company, which was the largest rendering company in the New York City area, was involved with a labor dispute of some sort, and yet P&H somehow was able to get 70-plus contracts from them. And consideration for that, P&H would grant loans to butchers from $50 to $3,000. Certain loans were charged with a fee and others were not. And the money came through the banks that we mentioned earlier, Lafayette Bank. So this is what Paul is legitimizing loan sharking. That's what he's doing. This is really some brilliant shit. And it just goes to show how smart Paul Castellano was. All right, so you're having union issues. I'm going to take 70 contracts off of your 200. We're going to give loans out at small interest rates or medium interest rates. This is legalized loan sharking is what it is, and it's controlling the union issues. Upon further searches, it showed that Paul Castellano was the owner of Patterson Rendering Company in New Jersey as well. And while certain coworkers were interviewed by the FBI, they claimed Paul came to work every day, took phone calls, only spoke in Sicilian, and the only guest that they ever saw him accept was Carlo Gambino. More informants would come forward and they would provide information doubling down on Paul's criminal activities, as each said that Paul was a made man and didn't become a captain until his uncle Frank retired. And that decision was made by Carlo Gambino. The Gambinos also made moves on the Manhattan waterfront as they installed Michael Clemente in as the Lower East Side pier boss. They explained that Clemente was a vicious killer, he was a boss, and that he was trying to venture out into the meat business with Michael Castellano. They also named another member of the Castellano crew as Frankie the Wop Gagliardi. And according to the paperwork I have, Castellano led his crew with Michael Castellano, Mike Clemente, Tommy Gambino, Frank Gagliardi, and other people. According to reports, they were all blood related. This is the Sicilian shit we always talk about. Everybody was interrelated, and I don't think a lot of people understand that the Gambinos were like that. Informants would also go on to provide that Castellano owned a fleet of hotels in Miami, their flagship hotel being the Palms on 121st Street in Miami. On March 8th of 62, Carlo Gambino was spotted by agents at Penn Station in New York City. 4 men met with Carlo at the station, and those men were Paul Castellano, Paul Gambino, Frank Funzi Thierry, and John Lombardozzi. Later that night, a black Cadillac pulled into Carlo Gambino's home, and Paul Gambino and Paul Castellano entered the home. A short while later, Carlo Gambino, flanked by Paul Gambino and Paul Castellano, came outside dressed in suits, got into their car, and left. Upon further investigation, another informant came forward and explained that Paul Gambino was a captain within the family and had his own crew as well. So Carlo brothers, cousins are all running the crime family underneath of him. The next entry with the FBI is June 15th of 62, and informant number T20 would explain that Paul had taken over all of the lunch trucks in the city, including Brooklyn and Manhattan, and those that were not aligned with Castellano had to kick back to him. It also is alleged here that Castellano had moved into bookmaking and loan sharking. Also provided was an allegation that Castellano completely controlled the 174 Union, the 342 Union, and Union 400. And all three of those unions were massive unions, and they were connected to the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Unions. Not only does he monopolize all of the meat cutting shit, the rendering companies, he's loan sharking to the butchers. Now he controls the fucking three of the biggest unions in the city. So there's a meeting we never knew about that we're going to talk about today. According to all of the reports, and this is pretty cool, I think that there were several meetings between Angelo Bruno, Paul Castellano, and Carlo Gambino. We know there were. And we know this because one of the participants told the feds about this meeting, and his name is Eddie Quirolo. Just who Eddie Quirolo is, you're going to find out here. He's a gangster. He's related to the Gambinos, but he owns a ton of land in different states. Under questioning from the FBI, he admits to knowing Angelo Bruno very well, and he admits to visiting South Philadelphia regularly. Now, Eddie owned 110 acres in Florida, and he was just one of several owners of that land. And according to Eddie, he sought out the advice of Angelo Bruno. The land was $180,000, and he was looking for investors. And it's through Angelo Bruno, a meeting gets set up, and it takes place down in Miami between Angelo Bruno, Paul Castellano, and Carlo Gambino. And this was in May of 1957. At this meeting, Quirolo explained and showed photos of the area, and Bruno, Gambino, and Castellano bought into the land. And the land would later be sold for over $30 million. And what is interesting, too, is that there was a fourth guy in on that land deal, and he also showed up at the meeting down in Florida. And the reason why is because this man owned over $200,000 in real estate down in Fort Lauderdale and the Hollywood, Florida area, and he knew the real estate scene better than most. That man? Well, let me give you the description. He's a Harlem-based gangster with the biggest numbers racket in history. He also has the biggest Shylock operation in Harlem. That man? Tony Salerno. Fucking unreal, right? Further down the file, there is a file called 92-643, and it caught my eye big time. Big time. And according to the report, an informant wanted to speak with a special agent in charge of the Castellano files. At the time, the AUSA was charging Joe Pagano, and he was an associate guy, a fraud bankruptcy case. An informant came forward and told agents that he would provide information about Pagano, the Mafia, and more, but he wanted to know how much they would pay him and what protection they could offer him in return for what he knew. He also had a very odd question for them. Word for word, right from the paperwork. Could we speak on Bobby Kennedy? I hope that too can be on the table. That's fucking insane. A meeting was set, but the informant never showed up. But later the FBI would find out that the informant was one of Paul Castellano's cousins. However, they don't know which one. They don't state, obviously, which one it was. But it's just weird. You know, he's willing to give up everybody on what's going on in this. And I hope Bobby Kennedy, we can talk about him too. Fucking odd. February 12th of 63, another informant comes forward and explains that Paul Castellano was a captain within the organization and that he has 35 men under him, which includes Paul Gambino, John Riccobono, Michael Clemente, John Lombardazzi, Vince Masso, and someone with the last name Guglielmeni, and guess who? Eddie Quirolo. Remember that name? We just mentioned him. There you go. All 35 under Castellano are related to the Castellanos and Gambinos by blood. 35 guys in a crew, all related by blood. There you go. See, a lot of people, they think that Carlo didn't agree with all that shit and he just kind of moved around. No, everybody was related. And there is power in that. And that's exactly what Andrangeta does today. So 3 more informants come forward and they describe a commission of New York gangsters who controlled the United States. And 5 sat as leaders on this commission, and that Carlo Gambino was really the head of this commission. And these informants are also the first to give up the boss, underboss, consigliere, and capo rank system to the FBI. And this is in 1963. Now, we know that Joe Valachi and Greg Scarpa were sort of telling them, but this is the first time somebody just walked in and says, no. This is exactly how it works. He had 35, Castellano has 35 guys underneath of him. That's huge. Huge. And so with that, next week, there's a reason why we're ending it here. Because next week we're going to get into some interesting shit. And it's getting better because Paul now starts moving into supermarkets and murder and more. And like I said, this was not necessarily about anything else, but the sheer power of the Castellanos and how much power they wielded. And in many ways, if you look at it, the choice Carlo made to come to America, it was a design choice. The Castellanos were pretty much juggernauts already in a seedy underworld. And Gambino shows up and just inserts himself. And I wonder if any of you now are starting to think, holy shit, maybe Paul was a bigger gangster than any of them. And my question to you is, does that change your thought process on who Paul Castellano was? And it should. It should be earmarked as holy fuck. And that's why we're doing it the way that we're doing it. That's why I don't want to go A, B, C, D, E, because to me, it's showing how Paul grew. We talked last week, he takes his first pinch. He learns from it. He says nothing. He gets indicted for the Appalachin thing. He says nothing. And he just slowly, steadily starts to build really an empire on his own. And like I said, that's why we're doing it this way. So you can see for yourself the things that were taking place and when. And for those that are curious, you can go to the FBI site and you can read some of these files for yourself, just as I have. You could see how powerful Paul was becoming. I have specific things that you have to apply for FOIA to get. And that's the big difference on what you guys get and what I can get, is because you have to read through 900 files and then you have to apply for the Freedom of Information Act for certain information with dates, times, and the players involved. And you have to be very specific or they'll never give it to you. And that's why I have a little extra than people don't. And that's where the true truth and the meat of what we know of the mob comes from. Not everything is 100% accurate, like I always say. But the trick here, and I'm sure Jacob Stoops and other people know this, is if you start to see the same log line of events echoed over and over with multiple informants, then the tendency is for it to be pretty accurate. But as we've seen on this show, great examples is one guy says one thing and there's 10 other things. We know that Castellano was not working for Joe Profaci in any sort of capacity, two different crime families. And that tells you that the source of their information doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. But that's why I always tell you guys, when these people like Nadeau, and even James Proctor, I hate to say it, I'm not trashing the guy, when they tell you they do research, they don't. Because if they did research, they would have 10 shows on 5 documents. That's how deep it goes. But they don't seem to know how to disseminate the information that's in front of them because they don't have mob acumen. And that's not knocking them. That's just the goddamn truth. That's for anybody that does research. Let me tell you something. Jake knows this better than anybody. I could tell you Angelo Bruno liked to fuck mice or monkeys or donkeys, right? He said, well, informant T7 said that he liked to go down to Tijuana like the donkey show. That's one guy fucking saying it. So the FBI looks into it. It's either true or not, whatever. But if you start to see multiple informants in different time periods telling the same fucking story, legitimately, ABCD comes ABCD. That's when you can start to say, okay, this is accurate. This is pretty accurate. Because 5 people at different times, different connections, are not going to all have the same information. And I think if we go back to some of the past shows that I've done, and I think I've showed you guys girls this pretty well. Some guys know certain things, but they don't have the dots. They'll say, oh, Russell Buffalino's the boss of the Gambino crime family. That's bad information. And that's somebody knowing that Buffalino is somebody, but he doesn't know exactly where he fits in. That's just gossipy bullshit. But 9 times out of 10, when you do research, Jake, I would love to talk to Jake about this because I guarantee you he's come across some shit and said, wow, same 4 guys, 4 informants, different time periods, different locations are all saying the same thing. That's when you know you're onto it. Now, does that mean that what they're saying is 100% the case? No. But 9 times out of 10, where there's smoke, there's fire, and that's where it tends to lead me. Now, there are some things that I've seen multiple informants say that I know is absolute bullshit. And I know that just from doing other research. And that's the thing about using FOIA, and that's the thing about these documents is these documents all draw a weird line to each other. It's almost like some sort of national treasure fucking Indiana Jones type of shit, because all these indictments kind of lead to other indictments and to other FBI files. And that's where you find the truth. It just didn't, like when I did the Kennedy show, it just did not come out of one set of files. It's like, okay, Joe Kennedy, Costello files, Luciano files, and then you have to start to look at connecting everything. And once you can kind of connect everything, that's what tells you the story. It doesn't mean it's 100% the truth. No, but you can get like the upper 85 to 90%. That's what I think. And that's how research is done. Research is not done by reading books, by reading articles from other people, to go into Wikipedia. That's not research. Research is paying a shitload of money for these documents, reading 2,400 pages in 3 months, and then coming back on here to a show and say, I have figured it out. I am dropping information nobody's ever seen. And so if you're trying to talk about the history of organized crime, the history is embedded in paperwork. And there is a truth to, if informants never say anything, we don't know anything. Sure, that's absolutely true, but it's not 100% the case. So that's it. That's it for this week. Please, everybody, thank you for all your support. And please come out and see us Saturday night and Sunday night. We're going to do the diner on Saturday. And boy, do we have some really gross shit to talk about on there. Interesting, weird shit women are doing. And Sunday, we are going to talk about JFK paperwork coming out, the mob, what to expect from that, and all the ramifications of what that might be. So once again, we are going to get into the Castellano Part 3. And so when we talked last week about Paul taking over and I want to say before we get going on this, the reason why this final part is a little shorter is because we're reaching a point in this story with Castellano where it's about to get very expansive and very large. And I didn't want to start a certain perspective and then end on it and then have everybody going, well, fuck, you stopped in the middle of this. So that's why this part isn't as long as it should be, or as long as it was last week. So here we go. Last week we talked about Paul taking over his own crew after his uncle Frank stepped down. And I don't know if really anybody's ever publicly stated that before or even mentioned Frank Castellano. I also don't think that anybody else has ever mentioned that Paul had over 30 guys within his crew and that everybody within that crew was related. And I think it just shows that maybe, Carlo was a bit more of a mustache Pete than we ever thought he was. And it seems like everybody that he kept in certain positions really further insulated him at the top of the leadership. And so we often talk about Carlo in terms of, and as well as like Luciano in terms of being opposite of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Yet in some ways, especially with Gambino, he kept certain facets of the things that they did. We also discussed how Paul was insanely powerful and wealthy, and this was not new to anybody, especially when the 1980s kicked in and JohnGotti began to have issues. And so we pick it up right where we left off. However, I got to say, I came across something in this set of reports that I've never seen in my life in an FBI report. It's very interesting. Typically, and just to sort of describe it to you, informants are given T1, T2, T3 names, and usually everything is massively redacted, and it's very particular in trying to hide who it is. However, what I came across in this part of the files is different. Usually the FBI goes to extremes to hide who their informants are. But for some reason, and I'm not saying that I know who these people are because I really don't, and that would take forever to try to figure out, even if I could somehow do it. They have some interesting things about these informants. So what the FBI did for some insane reason is they gave fucking descriptions of the most active informants against Paul. And that's where we're going to start because this is just odd. I've been through fucking probably 80,000 files, legitimately 80,000 pages of files in my life, maybe more, maybe less, but I've never seen this before. And it's insane. The form I'm about to read to you is dated November 19th of 1962. And the following, this is verbatim. The following are characterizations of the informants that we're utilizing. T1 is known as a private organization which maintains records relative to business concerns in the New York City area. That could be the Better Business Bureau. That could be like a bunch of different things. T2 is known as an individual with a criminal record who is familiar with hoodlums and their activities in Brooklyn. T3 is known as a person in a position to furnish information on a continuing level concerning a number of New York City hoodlums. T4 is known as a person with a criminal record who is acquainted with several hoodlums and their activities in New York and northern New Jersey. T5 is known as an individual who's a former employee. Now, this informant, I know who it is, and we'll unveil that here in a minute. T5 is a known individual and a former employee of Paul Castellano who can provide and has provided and will be providing information on his business dealings. And the reason why I know who T5 is just because of the information that's coming out. There's only one person that was typically running the whole entire meat industry for Paul, and we know who that is. That's why I believe that that's who this is. T6 is known as a career criminal with extensive criminal record who is in a position to furnish information against organized crime elements. T7 is known as somebody who can provide a lot of information about hoodlums leading New York City rackets. T8 is known as an individual with a long, lengthy criminal record who has close ties with some of the biggest criminals in New York City. He remains close to the top-tier hoodlums and will continue to provide information. T9 is known as a career criminal in the underworld who has close ties to hoodlums in Brooklyn his entire adult life. T10 is known as an individual who has contacts in New York City with Italian hoodlums. T11 is known as someone who has contacts in New York City rackets and will provide information about all organized crime in the metropolitan area. T12 is an individual in possession of a lot of information and has provided information on the Philadelphia Mafia and will continue to provide information, will continue to provide information on the Philadelphia mob and their relationships with New York City hoodlums. T13 is a municipal company which conducts criminal intelligence investigations in New York City. T14 is someone associated with a federal prosecutive agency in the New York City area. Now, we know who T5 is, and looking into everything that the FBI is discussing. T5 is a former employee of Castellano, and we know from cross-referencing the information that it's likely a guy by the name of James Gentile. We know that it's Gentile because later in the files, the FBI mentions him as a former employee of Castellano. Gentile, believe it or not, was the vice president of Pride Stores and TJR Supermarkets Incorporated. He also controlled Sunbeam Stores and Meat-O-Ramas and more. Gentile was actually the head of the meat operations for Castellano, and we know that he didn't come forward until 2 years after he was either fired or he quit. I don't know which one happened. It doesn't state it in the files. But Gentile went on to describe to them that at one point he was looking for work, and it was through Vincent Masso and Paul Gambino that he was introduced to Paul, and Paul hires him. Paul handed him the Meat-O-Rama on Fulton Street in Brooklyn, and Gentile excelled. According to reports, Gentile doubled the profits for Castellano within 6 months, and Castellano then hands him the reins of all of the meat operations in all of his stores, which meant he just oversaw everything. At some point, like I said, Gentile either quit or Gentile was fired. I'm not sure which it was. And then he begins to provide information. So he probably didn't quit. He probably gets shit canned. And that's why he's supplying the feds with information. But he gives this information to the feds about how the operations worked, the money involved, and who owned what. And it's through Gentile that the feds find out that Paul Gambino was trying to purchase a storefront in Brooklyn. The owners wanted $77,000, and Paul Gambino was not going to pay that. So according to Gentile, he walked in allegedly with a snub-nosed 38 and demanded a lower price. Eventually, the owners would settle for $55,000 and 6% of the profits for 1 year. What Gentile does next is pretty much give the FBI information on all or at least the majority of locations that Paul owned or ran in connection with Paul Gambino and Vincent Masso. He ended up giving them information about an inside job fire at the nationwide Meat-O-Rama and Food Center off Route 46 in South Hackensack, New Jersey. Paul Gambino was the owner and collected insurance on the fire. Upon investigation into the profits of that store, there were none. The business was bad. So I guess we can say, okay, light a fucking match. Further proving that was Gentile telling the FBI that Gambino lost over $100,000 within the store within a few months. He went on to talk about 50 other locations, who owned them, who worked there, and he knew the actual owners, who they were behind the scenes. He is the one who came forward and explained that Paul Castellano used front names as the business owners, but that secretly he owned all of them. Gentile also backed up claims of loan sharking through Lafayette Bank, as he described in detail that Paul was opening a new store and he wanted Gentile to acquire the loan. Gentile did as instructed, and on the loan for $50,000 was co-signed by Masso and Gambino. Upon research, the FBI could find no paper trail of any loan from this bank to Gentile, but he had a copy and provided a receipt. And without going into this is what I meant to say. We're not going to go through 50 stores here because it's just pointless. But he gave up everything he knew, and similar to what we've already talked about. Okay, so November 4th of 1958, an informant provided a list of 10 men who were going to see Paul Castellano while he was in jail on those contempt charges that we talked about for the Appalachin thing. And we have a copy of that visitors list. This is fantastic. Paul Gambino, Tom Sinatra, Frank Gambino, B. Musacco, Paul Gambino, Vincent Masso, Tom Masso, Joe Biondo, Neil Della Croce, and Joe Riccobono. These were the guys who were consistently coming to see Paul Castellano when he was locked up. I just read that one. Now, before I get into this part, I have to say that I was a little shocked by this. According to a report, it's saying that Carlo Gambino was married twice. So for the asshole who doesn't like me talking about, because he continues to assail me in these emails, Carlo Gambino would never cheat on his wife. Well, he did. Okay. And he was also married twice. A lot of people don't know that either. I have the report, and Carlo Gambino was married twice. It says that Gambino entered the United States in 1925, acquired his citizenship in either 1939 or 40, and he was divorced prior to 1945, meaning that Carlo was in fact married to somebody before, Paul's sister. It doesn't say exactly who he was married to, but the information was indexed by the FBI with court records. So it looks like Carlo was married prior to somebody else. And had a divorce sometime before 1945. The FBI would move on to interview Francesco Frank Gambino. For some reason, he agreed to a fucking interview, and I don't know why. However, it doesn't take long to see through the interview that he's lying his ass off. The interview was conducted at his apartment off of President Street in Brooklyn, New York. He claimed that he was not related to Paul Castellano or Carlo Gambino at all, which is a lie. He claimed that he was born in Gela, not Sicily, where Carlo was from. He would explain that, and if you don't know Carlo, how the fuck you know he's from Sicily? You know what I mean? He would explain that he had been a butcher all of his life, but in the last year he got sick and had to retire. He explained from 1928 to 1932, he worked for Benny Castellano at a butcher shop off 79th Street. He explained that he knew Benny well, and Benny's real name was Bartolo, and he knew through Benny Paul Castellano. He claimed he knew nothing about criminal acts or deeds or anything about the underworld whatsoever. He explained from 1953 to 1962, he owned his own butcher shop and upon questioning appeared confused when the agents brought up Toto Castellano. He also denied ever meeting Carlo. However, the FBI had photos of them together and phone records disputing his lies. He also admitted knowing Paul Gambino, but just loosely. He also claimed not to know who Joe Gambino was. When the FBI probed him about interfamily relations between the Scarpulas, the Massados, the Guglielminis, and the Gambinos, he said he had no clue. Frank claimed that he had 17 siblings, but he was the only one in the United States. The interview ended, and the feds really just did nothing with the information. Interestingly, in 1963, Paul Castellano makes some major fucking moves. What Paul does is put 2 of his stores into bankruptcy and ends up selling those stores. He then gets his hands into 70 locations and outlets, which at the time the feds thought was run by the Troons family. They also owned a meatpacking plant in Brooklyn, New York. And according to multiple informants, Paul was the new owner of these 70 outlets and was the new owner of the meatpacking plant. The other name on the ownership was the Roberts Meat Company, which was believed to be secretly owned by Paul Castellano as well. So there's several fronts here. Castellano also moves into food town stores and food parade stores. The informant would further explain that someone he knew who owned South Shore Packing Company was opening stores, and that they told him he needed permission from Castellano to even open a store, and that they were kicking back 10% of their profits to Castellano to even operate. Furthermore, it was found that Castellano had bought all of the shares into Dilbert's supermarkets and controlled the entire chain there. And listen, once again, the reason why I wanted to do this show was just because the amount of businesses this guy owned was staggering. John Gotti complaining about, Paul Castellano. Wow, he wants to be a chicken magnet. He didn't need to be anything. Paul owned everything. And that's what is a gangster you're supposed to do. On March 25th of 63, the informant would tell the FBI that Castellano frequently was meeting with the following men at one of the locations that Castellano owned in Brooklyn. And those men were Carmine Galante, Ugo Rossi, Paul Gambino, Pete Locascio, Carmine Locascio, Angelo Melli, and Neil Della Croce. And the purpose of these meetings, the informant wasn't aware of, but thought it regarded narcotics. The FBI would go to interview Melli after getting this information, and he refused to cooperate. And he explained that he was related to the Gambinos and the Castellanos by blood and never had heard the word mafia in his life. He explained that he once was involved in the meat business, and that was his only association with them professionally, other than just being related. At the time of the interview, he was under indictment and explained that he would relocate to Florida after his incarceration. Now, here is something cool. So when the FBI was surveilling Castellano and others, they often would sit outside of businesses and just watch. And they began to see something very interesting. Men would come all hours of the day, park in front of this establishment, get out of their cars, and they would go into the store. Seconds later, somebody would walk out of the store, move around to the right side fender, bend down, do something, and then go right back into the store. And then the owner of that car would then come out a few seconds later and leave. And this went on hundreds of times a day. And what the FBI found out through informants was these were numbers runners who were placing their receipts in a magnetic box under the wheel well. And that's just insane to me that they would go that far. So that's what they were doing. They were laying the receipts for the numbers in a box hidden under the wheel well. The guy would come out, take them out, put them in his pocket, and then go inside. So it's interesting. Here's another thing that I found to be interesting too. When Paul got pinched at Appalachin, under questioning by the cops, he explained that he drove to Appalachin for a roast beef sandwich and took his cousin Carlo, who was sick, to visit a friend. He also explained he didn't own any stock in any companies, which we know now is a complete lie. And for the most part, in this interview, Castellano explains his legit businesses, but he leaves it at that. He denies owning Roberts, and upon being shown documents, laughed at the agents posing questions. He denied being involved in organized crime, and he explained that in the past he cheated on his wife, but those days were over, and that he loves his family, stays home, and just wants to be with them. And he interestingly says to the agent, "But you already knew that because you sit outside my house." He does admit to making one mistake when he was 19, and that was the haberdashery robbery. And he basically said, yes, I was there, but I didn't have anything to do with it. Right after this, the FBI steps up its surveillance on Paul. And they had him almost on 24-hour sweepings or under 24-hour surveillance, and Paul just went to work and went home. And this went on for months and months and months and months. In October of 63, an informant comes forward and explains that Castellano was partners with Peter Ferrara, and together they owned JPJ Corporation, PP&F Corporation, Bath Beach Realty Corporation, and Sherratt Realty Corporation. Upon investigation, JPJ was the company which got the bid on Clove Lakes Expressway. The JPJ address also coincided with 4054 Highland Boulevard in Staten Island, which was owned by Peter Ferrara and Castellano. It was also found that Paul owned Forest Corporation, which was a dirt fill operation and was used by PP&J on all of their jobs. The Forest Corporation was also directly in association with Landfill Corporation, JPJ Corporation, and PP&F Corporation, all Castellano-owned businesses. When the FBI looked, they found that Paul wrote checks for the business purchase totaling 5 checks worth $42,439.05. However, these checks were written to an attorney friend of Paul's. And when we cross-referenced those checks, the attorney then wrote a check for the sum of $65,000 for the purchase of the land and the businesses. So it just shows the magnitude of what, Paul Castellano was kind of up to. And that's why we had to stop here, because he's about to move into something bigger and much more profitable, and it's very in-depth. But one of the unique things I wanted to talk about before we close out the show today, and once again, for those that are upset that it was a short show, I apologize, but next week we'll be back to full blast. I got doctor's appointments today and stuff like that. It's actually 1:42 on Friday. I got a doctor's appointment at 2:45, so I got to get out of here and boogie in a couple of minutes. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because one of the big complaints, one of the big things you see, and I've been guilty of saying this myself, is, Paul was very centrally focused on business. And the reality is he probably could have been a good businessman without having to join the mafia, but he wouldn't have had the money to operate without being a gangster, right? And so a lot of people consistently jump on this sort of train, this rabbit train of, Paul Castellano was a business guy, blah, 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 blah. He wasn't a gangster. Listen, Paul was a gangster. This is some gangster shit. And what I find to be interesting, and one of the things that I've learned in doing this is particularly on Paul Castellano, I think he had more money than Tony Salerno. I legitimately think he was bringing in $4 billion. Well, okay, maybe not $4 billion. I think he was probably, let's see, they said Tony Salerno's worth $2 billion total. I bet you Paul Castellano on his own was making $100 million a year. Just maybe even as small as $50 million a year, all on his own, legitimately. That's just legitimately. Never mind all of the criminal shit he had going on. But it just shows you that Paul knew, and now I think we have a clearer understanding of why Paul chose, or why Carlo chose Paul. It's not because, Carlo wasn't looking for a gangster who's going to grab a gun and kill somebody. He was looking for a guy who could legitimize and keep himself off the radar. And believe it or not, if Paul doesn't fuck up with the Westies, if Paul keeps a closer sort of eye on what Roy DeMeo does, and Tony Ducks Carallo doesn't feel like he's being fucked out of money, Paul Castellano may never go to fucking prison. And maybe historically now we look back, maybe we can make an argument, and I know you guys are all groaning because you know where I'm going with this, but maybe we can make an argument that maybe Paul Castellano was the second most profitable, interesting, not interesting, most profitable boss to Carlo Gambino. Because if you look at the two men, they're very similar in what they do. And listen, Paul had guys killed. He didn't fucking hesitate. And maybe in the past, because I hadn't really ever read any of this stuff before prior to, this is like all new. All of this material is new. So for me, I think I have a better understanding of who Paul is and who Paul was. Paul was very much like Carlo. In fact, I think he was better than Carlo at legitimizing himself. And the differences between the two men is, I've always said this and I'll stand by it, I think Paul got distracted by it. Think of 180, 200 stores, meatpacking plant. He's got all of this legitimate shit going on. And by the way, the Castellanos still control construction in this city. They still control all of the cement. Trust me when I tell you that. But that's the thing, is that I don't think Paul forgot he was a gangster. But I think that Paul was too focused or too blinded by it or too distracted by it to realize what was truly going on. So what? Paul doesn't hang out at the social clubs. Who gives a fuck? Why is that an issue? They didn't, fucking Gotti didn't hold Anastasia responsible for that. He didn't hold Carlo Gambino responsible for not hanging out at social clubs. So why was it different for Paul? And I believe I kind of know now why. I think Gotti was jealous of Paul's money. I think he really was. And I think that John Gotti had a certain viewpoint and a certain narrative of how a man and a gangster carry themselves. And I think his way of looking at Paul sitting in a multi-million-dollar home, never going out, making everybody come see him on Sunday mornings and talking about business and not being seen, not hanging out, not being one of the guys, I think Gotti just didn't like that. That's the flaw in John Gotti. Because if John Gotti had looked at Paul and realized this is how it's supposed to be done to insulate yourself. And if Gotti, and let's just say Gotti somehow ends up being boss, regardless of what we know happened, if he had just emulated what he saw, I don't think John Gotti ever goes to prison. I think John Gotti, he probably still, maybe he doesn't even get cancer, but that's a whole nother story and a different argument. But that's how you're supposed to be as a gangster. You make your money. You don't need to be seen. You just need to be heard. And Carlo did it right. Vinny Gigante did it right. Tony Salerno, they did it right. John Gotti did it wrong. Because John Gotti's whole antithesis was, fuck them. They know who I am. I know who they are. Let them prove it. And that's the wrong type of attitude to have. It's the wrong attitude to have. Sometimes less is more. And Gotti didn't go out and buy the $1 million house. He didn't do any of that. So, Gotti, to some extent, was frugal in some ways, but then, the $5,000 suits and being seen every other day, it led to his own demise. He put himself in that position. And it doesn't make him dumb. He was a different entity. He was sort of the walking version of Al Capone and Albert Anastasia wrapped into one. And if he had just taken a step back, it goes very differently for him. It goes very differently. But the one strong suit that Gotti had that I think he carried off of Paul and Carlo too was he knew how to put the right people in the right places. So he was a good leader in terms of knowing which guys to put where for maximum sort of financial gain. That was John Gotti's strong suit. His other strong suit was just doing what the fuck he wanted. A boss has to be able to just do what they want. They have to be able to mitigate certain things, but they have to be violent. You have to be. And John Gotti knew when to be violent. Problem is, I think the arrogance that sort of came with some of that, because all these mob guys are arrogant. Let's just be honest. They're all arrogant. John Gotti was no different than anybody else. But sometimes I think what has the tendency of happening is you get to be put in a position and you forget what it's like to come up the ranks and be threatened by small things. John Gotti could have been killed for a million different things throughout his life, as any mob guy, because like I said at the beginning of the show, is that you live on the edge. It's like a teeter-totter. You sit on the edge every day, and a small thing you do could get you killed. And when your whole life is sort of lived in that fashion, especially if you're not a high-ranking guy. I'm talking about before John Gotti became a captain and all of that. He could have been killed for a slew of different things. Just the McBratney hit alone, and the way that went could have gotten John Gotti killed. But I think he forgot that. I think if you're going to point at Castellano and say he forgot how to be a gangster, he forgot this, sure, he might have just been blindsided by his own greed, which I think is true. John Gotti, too, also forgot how he got there. And that's really the story. It doesn't make John Gotti or Paul Castellano or even Albert Anastasia, for that, doesn't make them any different. They're the same in many different ways. And if you look and if you've been with me for any amount of time, I always say this, and I mean it. History always repeats itself for a reason. And until somebody comes along that does not repeat that shit, that's when a family changes. That's why it's going to be interesting to see how Philadelphia fleshes out. And I wish I could be 100% honest about how I felt about that and talk about that, but I just can't, because I have a certain kind of feeling. And I kind of know how that's going to go. And I've kind of sort of alluded to that on this show of how I think that that's all going to go down. But if you're not going to learn from the past, you could be a steward of history all day long. But if you're not going to learn from that and you repeat the same mistakes, then it's doom and gloom. It's just doom and gloom. It's ego is a big, powerful thing. And if you can't keep that in check, yes, you have the power of life and death, like a god, so to speak. But if you can't keep that in fucking check, you are going to lose sight of everything. Paul, I think, had that problem. John Gotti, I think, had that problem. And you know how many other bosses? Nicky Scarfo had that problem. Guys like Vito Genovese had that problem. But if you look at other guys, Vinny Gigante did not have that problem. Tony Salerno did not have that problem. Raymond Patriarca did not have that problem. There are a lot of other bosses. Russell Buffalino was the best example of that. Did not have that problem. Carlos Marcello definitely had that problem. Tony Accardo did not have that problem. And if you look at the ones, and this is sort of a homework assignment if you guys want to do it, make a list of mob bosses that you know a lot of things that you know things about, and put ego was a problem, ego wasn't a problem. And I want you to name all of the bosses. And if you guys want to do this and actually submit the list to me, mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. If you make a list, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. If you put ego not a problem, ego a problem, you know what you're going to find? The ones that you write down where you say ego not a problem are the ones that didn't die in federal prison. They're the ones that died in their own beds, or they're the ones that had a 40-year reign. Guys that ego was a problem, and you start writing down, you're going to start to notice what I'm about to tell you. 4-year, 5-year runs. Rusty Rastelli, ego was a huge problem. Joe Massino, ego was a huge problem. Al Capone, ego was a huge problem. John Gotti, ego was a huge problem. Nicky Scarfo, ego was a huge problem. And if you do it that way, you're going to start to see it like right in front of you, and it's going to make more sense. Russell Buffalino, not a problem. Raymond Patriarca, not a problem. Santo Trafficante, not a problem. And the list just goes on and on and on and on. So do that. It's just a practice in futility of, holy shit, he's right. He's absolutely right. And you're going to notice that all of the guys that have the ego issues also have a ton of murders on the jacket too. I'm serious. Do it. Just do it. Even if you only put 4 names on each side, just do it because you're going to be like, holy shit, he's exactly right. That's why I love doing this show. It's things like that. Anyway, I'm going to get out of here for today. It's Friday. I got to rush to the doctor. One more scan. One more guy. You know, I'm going to tell you something. When you have the problem that I have, like, you know, I don't want to go into totally what's going on with me, but sometimes digesting stuff and because my body was like racked with like fucking just horrible fucking infection. Once you start eating again, it just takes some time to work through, right? But I'm going to tell you, every time I cough or sneeze, it's like somebody stabbing my stomach. It's horrible. And so when I saw my doctor last week, I said, you know, how long are these fucking symptoms going to last? He goes, well, it could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months. And I'm like, 6 months? He's like, yeah, sometimes it takes, 6 months for your body to get back to normal. I've had fucking major surgeries where I'm back to normal in 3 weeks. You're telling me 6 months I got to deal with this shit? He's like, yeah, it's just the way it is, unfortunately. So I may look fine, but I would say I'm at like 85%, 86%, 87%. I'm not totally there yet. It's hard. It's hard. It's not the easiest thing in the world. And I'm on a diet. I got to eat the right stuff so it doesn't inflame certain things. And that's hard because you go to the store and you're staring at the food and you're like, oh, I'd really like to eat that. And I made a mistake. Oh, did I make a mistake? And I ate a pizza. I'm not allowed to eat pizza. Just because for a couple of weeks, up to a month, I can't. I did it anyway. And oh my God, did I pay for that? Right? And that was 2 weeks ago, right? So then the other night, once again, without getting into too many details, I decided to drink some gin. Mainly because I wanted to kind of get this pain to subside a little bit because I don't want to take, narcotics. So I drank like half of a fucking handle of gin. I felt fantastic. Beautiful. I'm like dancing, goofing around, hanging out with some people, having a good time. And a buddy of mine looks at me and goes, you're going to so regret that. You can't drink that shit. You're not supposed to be drinking that. That's going to hurt the fuck out of you. And I'm like, fuck it. Because you're buzzing. Who gives a fuck? Oh God, did I regret it the next day. It was awful. Horrible fucking experience. Horrible fucking experience. But I needed the fucking pain to stop. And that was, it's hard for me. I want to go and smile and see people and just get away from work and just, it's hard for me. It's just hard. So I'm like, fuck it. I'm going to buy a fucking handle of gin, drink some gin and tonics. I'm only going to have one just for the taste. Well, 1 led to 2, 2 led to 10, 10 led to whatever. Yeah. And it was not a very pleasant experience the next day. I was telling my doctor in a text today, I got to get out of here. But I was telling my doctor in a text, I was like, yeah, he's like, how you doing? I said, I drank some gin. He goes, what the fuck? Are you crazy? Because you can't do that. You are going to put yourself back in the hospital. I said, well, the pain sucks. He goes, I'll prescribe something. I said, no. I said, no, I'm not. I'm just not going to take that shit. He's like, you are going to kill yourself. Like, stop. I was like, all right. So, is what it is. is what it is. All right. Have a great weekend. We will see all of you back here next week.